December 14th, 2000. With her beloved schnauzer, Nikki, riding shotgun, 25-year-old schoolteacher Holly drives through the snowy streets of Wichita to an address on East Birchwood Drive, planning to spend the night with her boyfriend. Sharing the triplex condo with two roommates, her 26-year-old boyfriend Jason Beaufort, a charming high school teacher and junior basketball coach, isn't there when she arrives. But having been given a key of her own, Holly lets herself into the house. Inside, she's greeted by Jason's two warm and welcoming roommates, 29-year-old budding priest Aaron Sander and 27-year-old financial analyst Brad Haka. Soon after, 25-year-old preschool teacher Heather Muller arrives at the apartment to join them. Although she had once dated Aaron, as devout Catholics the two had ultimately chosen to part ways, with Aaron intending to become a priest and Heather planning to become a nun. Despite this, the pair were still extremely close friends. Waiting for Jason as he finishes coaching basketball at Augusta High School, Holly grades papers in his room. When Jason finally arrives home, the group sit down for dinner together, planning to have a cozy evening eating great food, watching TV and chatting into the night. As the night comes to a close, Jason checks all of the doors are locked before everyone heads to bed. With Heather taking his room, Aaron sets himself up on the living room couch. In his bedroom, Jason, Holly, and Nikki the schnauzer curl up together. But just as they get comfortable, the porch light suddenly flicks on. As Jason complains he's gonna have to get up and turn it off again, they overhear what sounds like Aaron talking to someone, presumably at the front door. Holly glances at the clock over Jason's shoulder, seeing that it's past 11 p.m., which seems late for someone to be knocking at the door. The muffled voices grow louder, turning into what sounds like shouting. And then, the bedroom door suddenly flies open without warning. Startled by the loud bang, they both jump out of their skin. Their shock instantly turns to terror as they look up to see a tall man standing in the doorway, pointing a gun at them. The man storms into the room and yanks the blankets off the bed, followed by a second man who drags Aaron into the room at gunpoint and shoves him onto the bed. In the darkness, it's hard to see the faces of the two men clearly, though the second man looks to be shorter and less muscular than the first. Nikki begins growling and barking at the intruders, baring her teeth. So one of the gunmen points his gun at her and coldly mutters, "Grab your dog, or we'll shoot her." Terrified, Holly does as she's told, before the two intruders demand to know who else is in the apartment. Too scared to defy them, the trio tell them about Brad and Heather. So one of the men leaves the room, the other keeping Holly, Jason, Aaron, and the dog at gunpoint. Moments later, the first man returns with Brad in his boxer shorts and Heather still fully clothed. With guns pointed at the five friends, the two gunmen then order them all to remove their clothes. And so begins one of the most brutal acts of violence in the history of Kansas that has come to be known as Around a week earlier, on December 8th, 23-year-old Wichita State University baseball player Andrew Schreiber stopped at a come-and-go convenience store for some chewing tobacco when two young men approached him. Pulling a gun on him, the pair forced him into his own car, ordering him to drive to a number of ATMs, with one of them holding him at gunpoint and the other following in a different vehicle. His heart pounding, Andrew tried to stay calm and to do what he was told, hoping it would mean they might let him go unharmed. Handing over a total of $800 he was able to withdraw before his card was blocked. They made Andrew drive to a field northeast of town. There, they beat him with a pistol, pushed him out of the car, and shot out his tires before fleeing the scene in the other vehicle. 4 days later, on December 11th at around 9:30 in the evening, a pair of armed men crossed paths with 55-year-old librarian Ann Walenta, a talented cellist who played with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra. Ann was a devoted wife and mother to two, known for assisting various programs to help introduce young African-American students to classical music. On that night in her quiet neighborhood in East Wichita, Ann pulled up in her SUV in front of her suburban home, when a man suddenly appeared beside her car, asking for help. Having already suspected she was being followed, she only cracked the window open slightly so she could hear him. But before she could even react, the man shoved a gun into the opening and ordered her not to move, with a second man suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Terrified, Ann ignored his command and kicked her car into gear. But as she tried to drive away, the man opened fire on her vehicle, shattering the window and hitting her body 3 times. Critically wounded and clinging to life, Ann forced herself to act, pushing herself onto the car horn. In such a quiet neighborhood, there was no chance that the police were not going to be called with the loud car horn blaring following the sound of potential gunshots. Rushed to hospital, Anne clung desperately to life, managing to offer a handful of details about her attackers to investigators. Enough for them to believe she had been targeted by the same two men who had robbed and abducted Andrew days earlier in the area. But despite her fight to survive, her injuries were too severe, and Anne passed away a couple of weeks later. Because the actions of the two men had escalated substantially in a matter of days, investigator Kevin Brasser believed that if they didn't find them, they were likely to strike again and again, with their crimes getting worse and worse each time. And sadly, he was right. While Anne was still alive and fighting to survive in hospital, the two men selected their next target. This time, they arrived at the house on East Birchwood Drive, picking it at random, with Holly, Jason, Brad, Aaron, and Heather about to become the next victims in their unprecedented spree of violence. Ordered to remove their clothes at gunpoint, all 5 of the captives had no choice but to obey. Naked and shivering, they were forced to stand in silence as the shorter gunman left the room and began ransacking the house, searching for valuables. Unable to find anything much, the taller gunman shook his weapon at them, demanding them to tell him where their money was, where their safe was, certain they would have one. But there was no safe to be found. So pleading for their lives, the group told the two men to take anything they wanted. They even each listed off the amount of money in their accounts when asked, telling the two gunmen they could take their bank cards and withdraw everything they had. But it wasn't just money the intruders were after. They then took Holly and Heather out of the bedroom, over to a small wet bar area just outside the room. Held at gunpoint, they forced the two women to perform sexual acts on each other, before bringing Heather back into the bedroom and dragging out Brad in her place. With their guns trained on him, they commanded Brad to have sex with Holly. But through terror and disgust for what was happening, Brad was unable to get aroused and do as they ordered him. Growing frustrated and angry with him, the gunmen yanked him away and replaced him with Jason. But Jason's body was similarly unable to obey the demands. Remembering Jason was Holly's boyfriend, one of the gunmen muttered, "That's his girl," before telling him he wasn't allowed to do it with his own girlfriend anyway. So they shoved him back in the bedroom and then dragged Aaron out to the bar, but Aaron refused to assault Holly as he had been ordered to, pleading with them to stop. So one of the gunmen struck him hard in the back of the head with his weapon, knocking him to the floor. Terrified, but knowing they had no choice if they wanted to stay alive, Aaron and Holly tried to do what their attackers wanted them to. Eventually, the gunmen took Holly back into the bedroom with Brad and Jason, shoving all 3 of them into a closet with Nikki the dog, and telling them to be quiet or they'd face severe consequences. Then they pulled Heather back to the bar, trying to force Aaron to have sex with her instead. When Aaron again couldn't do what they commanded of him, they gave him an ultimatum. He had 2 minutes to get hard and do what they told him, or they'd start hurting them. They counted down the minutes from 11:52 to 11:54, but nothing changed for Aaron. So one of them grabbed a golf club and began viciously beating him with it as punishment. This routine continued, with the attackers forcing Jason and then Brad to have sex with Heather, beating them when they tried to refuse. The rest of the friends were forced to listen in the closet, shivering and crying as Nikki the dog whimpered in fear. The whole ordeal went on for around an hour, with all 5 of the friends left feeling broken and traumatized. Eventually, they told the group that they were now going to be taken individually to ATMs to withdraw money, letting them out of the closet to locate their car keys. With this pause in the abuse, the group were able to subtly begin noting details of what their attackers looked like. Both were black men, with similar enough features it looked like they could be brothers. The taller man was wearing a black leather coat and gloves with an orange FUBU sweater, while the shorter man had hair Holly would later describe as clumped and poofy. With everything that was going on, none of them were able to locate their keys in the ransacked house, causing the 2 gunmen to lose their patience and threaten to kill one of them if the keys didn't show up soon. Finally, Jason spotted the keys to his truck back in his bedroom. So the taller gunman ordered him to dress before leaving with him, the shorter man remaining with the other 4 friends. Sending Aaron, Brad, and Heather back into the closet, the remaining intruder made Holly lie down on the floor, lowering his gun as he prepared to assault her himself. As he began, Holly's eyes glanced to the gun. Less than 2 feet away, her mind raced. Could she grab it before he could stop her? Could she actually shoot him even if she did manage to grab it? Unable to overcome the fear of what would happen to them all if she failed, Holly eventually chose not to try and grab it, silently enduring the assault for around 5 minutes before she was taken back to the closet. The intruder then took Heather out with him, forcing the remaining 3 friends to listen in silence as she cried out. Aaron, in particular, couldn't stop himself from crying as he listened to her being assaulted. Eventually, Aaron whispered to Brad, "Do you think they're going to kill us?" To which Brad remained silent. After a while, the taller attacker returned with Jason, forcing him to remove all of his clothes again, before making Brad dress and accompany him outside to withdraw money in his place. After Brad, the man chose Holly as the next one to accompany him outside. But unlike the 2 men, he only let her put a sweater on, leaving her completely naked from the waist down as she stepped out into the snow with him. Getting into Jason's truck, the gunman instructed her to drive, keeping his weapon focused on her as she backed out of the driveway and onto the icy streets. Alone with him, the unnerving silence was broken when the gunman asked her what his partner had done to her and the others while he was gone. Telling him the truth, she explained what had happened, including how the other gunman had forced her to have sex with him. But rather than showing any sort of compassion, he simply laughed at the idea, asking her if she enjoyed it. Scared of enraging him, Holly made the split-second decision to lie to him and to play along, simply responding with a yes, hoping to keep him calm. He continued questioning her, asking if his partner was better than Jason, if she'd ever been with a black man before, and if she'd enjoyed being intimate with a girl. After a while of playing along with him, Holly's fear finally took over, and she couldn't help but ask if they were planning to kill them, offering him to take anything he wanted as long as he didn't kill them. The gunman assured her that once they were finished, they would all be left alive. At an ATM, Holly rolled down her window and slid her card into the machine to withdraw as much cash as she was able to. As she pressed buttons on the machine, she felt the gunman's hand slide in between her legs and start to touch her. Shocked and struggling to keep calm, Holly finished the transaction and handed him the money. As the pair continued to drive around to ATMs, the man sighed and remarked that he'd wish they'd met under different circumstances, as he thought they would have probably hit it off. Disgusted but still not wanting to aggravate him, Holly once again played along with him. When they arrived back at the house, Erin was forced to take her place and leave with the attacker, with Holly being stripped and led back into the closet. By the bar with Heather, the shorter gunman lifted a bottle of whiskey, pouring himself a drink. He then opened the cupboard door, asking Brad, Jason, and Holly if they wanted some, an offer they all turned down. Then he passed Holly Nikki's muzzle, watching as she put it on her dog, before he slammed the door shut again. As he sipped his drink, the intruder picked up a popcorn tin which made an odd sound as he shook it. Opening it, he found what appeared to be an engagement ring. Jason then revealed that he was planning to give it to Holly on December 22nd. In this horrible, unimaginable situation, Holly had just learnt that the man she loved was going to ask her to marry him. Showing no emotion, the intruder pocketed the ring. When Erin and the tall man returned, Holly was yanked out of the closet. Seeing how scared she was, the shorter man then said something that shook her to her core. "Relax. We're not going to shoot you. Yet." Holly flinched at the final word. Despite the conversation she'd had with the other man in the car, she was now certain the duo intended to kill them. He then forced her onto all fours and proceeded to assault her again. Finished, he took her to the bathroom where the taller man was assaulting Heather. When he finished, despite his claims in the car of how he'd like to have met Holly under different circumstances, the taller man then assaulted her too. Throwing what was likely a condom into the toilet and flushing it, the 2 men brought Holly and Heather back to the bar where the 2 women watched as they whispered among themselves, planning their next moves. Eventually, they had them both put sweaters on again, before leading them barefoot and naked from the waist down out into the garage, where they made them both climb into the trunk of Erin's Honda Accord. Moments later, Brad, Jason, and Erin were brought down, all completely naked this time, and told to get into the trunk with the 2 women. But realizing all 5 of them clearly couldn't fit, the attackers changed their plan. The 3 men were locked in the trunk, while the 2 women were led over to Jason's truck. With the tall man driving the truck and the shorter man driving the Honda Accord with the 3 men in the trunk, the vehicle set off. Eventually, Holly summoned the courage to ask where they were being taken, to which she was told they're going to be dropped off somewhere far enough away to not cause them any issues. Eventually, the 2 vehicles came to a stop on a snow-covered field, where the trunk of the car was opened and the 3 men were dragged out. They then ordered them to kneel in front of the car. Knowing they were about to be shot, Holly and Heather could do nothing to help as they too were forced out of their vehicle and made to kneel beside the three men in the snow. Heather knelt beside her ex-boyfriend Aaron, while Holly took her place beside Jason, the man she loved and was going to ask her to marry him. And then Aaron pleaded for his life, stuttering, "Please, no sir, please, but..." And then the gun was placed behind Holly and Holly's vision exploded as she dropped down onto the snowy grass. But somehow, despite being shot in the head, she remained conscious. In Holly's own words, "I felt the bullet hit the back of my head. It went kind of gray with white like stars. I wasn't knocked unconscious. I didn't fall forward. Then someone kicked me, and I had fallen forward. I was playing dead. I didn't move. I didn't want them to shoot me again." Then, after a painful silence, she heard an engine rumble to life. Before Holly could even contemplate moving, the truck accelerated forward and ran over the 5 bodies. It took everything in her not to scream as the truck moved across her body, but she remained silent, and somehow still remained conscious. She listened as the sounds of the truck grew quieter, moving further and further away. Eventually, she dared to move her head enough to see that the truck and the 2 gunmen were gone. Struggling to move, to even breathe, Holly tried to call out for Jason, Brad, Aaron, and Heather, but nobody responded to her. When she was certain the truck's headlights had completely vanished, Holly forced herself up from the snow, turning to see the man she loved and their 3 friends all lying face down in the blood-covered snow. Unsure if anyone was alive or dead, she dropped to Jason's side, turning him over to see blood squirting everywhere, even out of his eyes. So she pulled her sweater off and wrapped it around his head, hoping it might stop the bleeding, refusing to believe he wasn't still alive. Brad was the next one she turned over. But his body was in such a bad state, it was immediately clear he was dead. Heather and Aaron were in equally bad states. Freezing cold as she stood naked in the snow, blood oozing from the gunshot wound in her head, her body aching from being run over, Holly looked around desperately for help. Then she spotted lights in the distance near the highway that looked like a house strung up with Christmas decorations. Despite being barefoot, naked, and shot in the head, she somehow managed to walk over a mile in the freezing cold, trudging through snow, across a field, over barbed wire, past a construction site, around a pond, and through thick brush. Yet if it wasn't a difficult enough journey to make already, every time headlights appeared on the road, she threw her naked body down against the snow until they passed, worried her attackers might be returning. Eventually, she reached the house with the beaming Christmas lights shining into the night. So she rushed to the front door, pounding on it and ringing the bell over and over. Inside the house, a young couple peered out of the window to see the naked woman covered in blood and shivering on their porch. They hurried to get her inside and wrap her in blankets. Before they could call 911, she stopped them. Certain she was about to die, she needed to tell them everything that had happened first. Listening to her horrifying story, they finally called the police. But having still remained conscious, Holly took over the phone and managed to explain to the dispatcher exactly where the field was so they could go and find her friends, still clinging to the belief that at least Jason was still alive. Detective Rick Craig was among the emergency responders who arrived at the field around 3 a.m. that night. Approaching the scene, Detective Craig shivered from the bitter cold, made worse by a strong, icy wind. But as he saw the 4 naked bodies lying in the bloodied snow, each with gunshot wounds to the back of their head, he recounted that, "I wasn't cold anymore." As you've already guessed, all 4 of the friends were dead. Speaking to Holly briefly before paramedics rushed her to hospital, they were able to put an alert out on Jason's stolen truck. It would later turn out that the bullet meant for her brain had been miraculously deflected by a butterfly hair clip, and the truck had equally miraculously failed to crush her body. Unbeknownst to her, while Holly was fighting to survive and make it to the house, the 2 men had returned to the triplex on Birchwood Drive to continue pillaging it. Sadly, as well as Jason, Aaron, Brad, and Heather, they murdered Holly's dog Nikki, leaving her in a pool of blood on one of the beds. That morning, Sedgwick County District Attorney Nola Folston was informed that detectives were investigating a quadruple homicide. Bizarrely, only 8 days earlier another unrelated quadruple homicide had occurred in the area, with the 2 perpetrators already in custody. Initially, Folston thought the dispatcher informing her was mistakenly referring to the previous case, unable to believe that another quadruple murder could have occurred in the space of a single week in the same county. Just like Falston, all of Wichita was in disbelief when the news of what had happened hit their television screens that morning, with stations broadcasting the plate number of Jason's truck. Watching the story on the news, Christian Taylor suddenly realized that he had seen a truck that perfectly matched the description parked near his apartment complex earlier that morning. Reporting it to the police, officers rushed to the apartment complex and were able to immediately confirm that it was, in fact, Jason's truck parked outside. Then another resident of the complex approached the officers, telling them that he had helped a man carry a large-screen TV into an upstairs apartment, wondering if it could be connected. With the resident signaling which apartment it was, the officers surrounded it and knocked on the door. Moments later, a tall black man stepped out onto the back balcony, raising up his leg onto the railing to jump out. But he froze as he saw more officers waiting for him out back, causing him to retreat back inside. A white woman, Stephanie Donley, answered the door to the police, who rushed inside and handcuffed the tall man as he looked for another way to flee. This man was Reginald Carr, a 22-year-old from Dodge City with an extensive criminal record. Perfectly matching Holly's description of the taller gunman, police suspected the shorter man to be his younger 20-year-old brother, Jonathan. From Stephanie, who turned out to be Reginald's girlfriend, the police learned that his brother, Jonathan, was driving a late-model Plymouth Fury, so this detail was added to the news reports on the case. By the afternoon, Andrew Schreiber, the baseball player the two men had robbed, saw Reginald's face on the news and instantly recognized him. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called the police, telling them that Reginald was one of the two men who had robbed and abducted him days earlier. Around the same time, healthcare worker Toni Green returned home early from work as she was feeling sick. In her house, she saw that her daughter Tronda's boyfriend was sleeping on her couch. Having only been dating for a couple of weeks, she didn't know him well. And looking at him now, having heard all of the news reports about what had happened that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that he perfectly matched the description of one of the attackers. And she was right. Sleeping on her couch was the shorter gunman, Jonathan Carr. Trusting her gut, Toni subtly lifted his leather jacket and searched through the pockets, locating a small jewelry box containing the diamond engagement ring she had heard had been stolen on the news. Looking outside, she then saw a Plymouth Fury parked on the street. Now certain a killer was in her house, Toni tried to be as quiet as possible as she told her daughter to grab her young niece and leave the house immediately. Not understanding the threat, Tronda slowly tried to put her shoes on, knowing the ground outside was covered in snow. But Toni told her to leave them and run. So the three of them rushed out of the house, bare feet slipping on the snow as they stumbled across the road to a neighbor and dialed 911. Panicked, Toni told the dispatcher that the man they're looking for is in her house. When she looked back, Jonathan was standing on her porch in jeans and a t-shirt, staring directly at her. Then he bolted away. Police arrived at the scene almost instantly and gave chase, pursuing him for 2 blocks before they finally caught up with him and apprehended him. Searching his body, they found around $1,000 in cash in his pockets, alongside the diamond ring. Less than 12 hours after the murders, both Reginald and Jonathan Carr were in custody. Detectives showed their images as part of a lineup to Ann Walenta, who was still clinging to life in hospital. She immediately identified Reginald as the man she had seen shoot her. Holly would later also identify Reginald when she was well enough to be formally interviewed. It's worth mentioning, Anne also pointed out another individual as potentially being the second man she saw, but it wasn't Jonathan. It was a man who was in prison at the time of the shooting. It's clear Reginald and Jonathan were responsible for her attack, but I just thought it was worth including this detail as it helps highlight the problems in using witness testimony and identification as evidence. With a warrant to obtain DNA, hair, blood, and saliva, samples were taken from the two brothers. As his were being taken, Jonathan struck up a conversation with one of the detectives on his case, Kelly Otis. Detective Otis recalled that Jonathan asked him about the other quadruple homicide that happened on the 7th of December, inquiring what happened to the two men who were arrested. Otis calmly told him that they were charged with capital murder, which he had to explain to Jonathan meant if they are convicted they could be sentenced to death. Inquisitive, clearly expecting a similar scenario to play out for himself, Jonathan then asked how they execute someone, being told it would be by lethal injection. A moment later he asked, "Do you feel anything?" To which Detective Otis simply responded, "We've never been able to ask anyone." After Anne passed away in hospital, she was officially confirmed as the fifth victim of the Carr brothers when a handgun was located along Route 96 near the field where the four friends had been executed. The Kansas State Crime Lab then confirmed that the weapon had been used in the murders of the four friends, as well as the murder of Anne, and even the shooting out of Andrew's tires after he had been abducted and robbed. Although the full extent of Reginald and Jonathan's crimes during this time period was never truly determined, there was no doubt that the brothers were responsible for these three separate incidents. As you can imagine, Wichita was overcome by a wave of fear and paranoia after the case hit the headlines, leading to an immediate surge in sales of home security systems and guns. Although it appears the victims chosen by the Carr brothers were random, many commentators picked up on the fact that the two black killers had only targeted white victims, arguing that hate crime charges should be pursued. District Attorney Foulston dismissed this idea, stating, "It reasonably appears that these were isolated incidents where individuals were chosen at random in a random act of violence. The fact that the defendants and victims happen to be of different races has no bearing. Let's just look at the underlying crimes." Wichita Mayor Bob Knight also chimed in on the topic, telling reporters, "You have innocent people tortured, killed, humiliated by someone who is little more than an animal. I'm not looking at it as a black and white issue. I'm not a big fan of capital punishment. But if anything deserves people losing their lives, it is this kind of heinous crime." Despite this, certain groups latched onto the idea to fuel their own narratives. In particular, a number of white supremacist groups used what the Carr brothers had done to push their own agendas, promoting it as an example of a hate crime directed at white people. Similarly, many Wichita residents felt that the barbarity and depravity of their crimes could not have been done without some sort of hatred motivating them. While it's possible this was the case, there isn't any evidence to back it up. If anything, I think it shows just how terrifying and unthinkable their actions were that people simply couldn't believe they were capable of such brutal acts, without any real motive beyond robbery or the thrill of doing it. Chiming in on the discussion, the Wichita Eagle wrote, "The randomness of the attacks was especially chilling. It could have been anyone. But we go on with our work, hold our loved ones a little closer, and face down our fears as best we can. The survivors are showing us how." Reginald and Jonathan, born in Dodge City, Kansas, both had extensive criminal backgrounds by the time the Wichita massacre took place. As children, they lived in a very troubled household, which their mother Janice later described as lacking love or warmth. Their parents argued relentlessly, with their father hitting and abusing their mother. At one point, Janice herself snapped and beat their father with a baseball bat in front of them. They had two sisters, a younger one who died when she was only 3 years old from leukemia, and an older one who later recounted that she had been sexually abused at the hands of their father. When their parents divorced, their father completely abandoned and disowned them all. And according to their older sister, her mother's new boyfriends frequently abused both of the brothers. Janice would later remarry, but her second husband was just as violent as her first one. There was even an incident where he put a gun to her head and threatened to kill her. Reginald and Jonathan were often sent to stay at their maternal grandmother's house, but she was similarly volatile, yelling and screaming at them. Janice herself wasn't a lot better in how she treated her children, frequently physically punishing them with electrical cords and other makeshift weapons. As a result of all the violence and trauma around them, both boys struggled in school, regularly getting into violent altercations, causing them to have to move to 8 different schools by the time they reached 8th grade. It was also claimed that Reginald was protective of his younger brother, often taking the blame for things he had done so he wouldn't be punished. Psychologist Thomas Reedy later detailed how Reginald was introduced to drugs and alcohol at the age of 6, and was drinking heavy liquor by the time he was 11 years old. Reginald ultimately dropped out of high school in 9th grade after attacking another student, avoiding being expelled again. Around the same time, Jonathan actually attempted to take his own life by drinking antifreeze. Although the majority of the brothers' criminal records were sealed as part of the trial, some of Reginald's record is publicly available, and it shows that he served multiple stints in prison from the age of 18 onwards, predominantly for charges related to drug offenses and aggravated assault. After being released from prison in March of 2000, Reginald was arrested in November for assault charges, alongside parole violations and drunk driving, but due to a paperwork error, he was released in December. Because of this error, he was able to begin his crime spree days later, rather than being in prison as he should have been. Reginald and Jonathan faced a total of 113 charges, which included capital murder, various forms of physical and sexual assault, robbery, and even animal cruelty. Their case was set to be overseen by Judge Paul Clark, with District Attorney Falston leading the prosecution alongside her deputy Kim Parker. Reginald's defense team was led by Jay Greeno, an ex-public defender, and Val Wachtel, while his brother Jonathan's lawyers were Mark Manna and Ron Evans. Initially, the defense teams tried to have the trial separated for the two brothers, arguing that because both teams were planning to shift blame onto the opposite brother from the one they were defending, they would essentially both be facing two sets of opposition. The judge denied this request, citing that the trial was expected to last 2 months and to feature around 70 witnesses, making it too costly to do twice, especially as it was common practice for those accused of committing crimes together to be tried together. The defense also attempted to have the trial moved out of Sedgwick County, using a poll that showed 74% of local residents believed the Carrs were guilty to show that a fair trial in Wichita would be impossible. This motion was again denied, with Judge Clark stating that no trial had been moved out of the county in 40 years, and he wouldn't be making an exception for this one. Jonathan's team even attempted to have him declared unfit to stand trial, but Judge Clark ruled him competent after reviewing reports from 2 mental health experts. So with the trial date finally set, both the prosecution and the defense thoroughly questioned potential jurors, ruling people out for opinions on the death penalty, being too familiar with the case, and having any vague connection to any of the victims involved. In the end, a jury of 7 men and 5 women, 2 black and 10 white, was put together, pulling people from all walks of life. When the trial began almost 2 years after their initial arrests, much of the witness testimony was disturbing, but none more so than the account given by Holly about what she and her friends had endured. In graphic detail, she recounted all of the assaults, robberies, and murders, identifying Reginald clearly as the taller gunman. Sedgwick County Coroner Mary Dudley testified about the various wounds on the 4 friends, explaining that Heather and Aaron had been shot with a gun pressed to their heads, while Brad and Jason had been shot from a slightly further distance. Coroner Dudley detailed various other injuries on the victims, focusing on evidence that showed Heather had been sexually assaulted, and the 3 men had all been beaten throughout the night. Jonathan's lawyer, Mark Mann, tried to get her to state that the distance of the shootings alongside the lack of a pause mentioned in Holly's account implied one person was responsible, indicating that Reginald was the killer. But Dudley couldn't say one way or the other based on the forensic evidence. Another witness, Dr. Scott Porter, gave evidence about the injuries sustained by Anne after being shot in her car using an anatomical model, which led to one of the jurors fainting. Andrew Schreiber, the only survivor other than Holly, provided testimony about how he had been kidnapped and robbed, identifying Reginald as one of his 2 kidnappers. But like everyone else, he couldn't directly identify Jonathan. When cross-examined, Andrew admitted he had been unable to pick either of the brothers out of a photo lineup shortly after they were arrested. As well as this testimony, hundreds of items of physical evidence were used to directly link the 2 brothers to the murders. These included a wide range of belongings stolen from the Birchwood Drive apartment that were found in both of their homes, such as a TV, clothing, and credit cards. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the diamond engagement ring, taken from the home and found in Jonathan's pocket. The prosecution had even located a watch stolen from Andrew at the home of one of the brothers. Alongside this evidence, forensic investigator Gary Miller testified that a shoe print found at the Birchwood Drive apartment had been matched to Jonathan's shoes. He also went into detail to explain how the gun discovered near the highway could be directly tied to all 3 separate incidents, though he admitted the gun itself could not be directly linked to either of the Carr brothers. Sidney Schuler of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation then took the stand, testifying that Jonathan's DNA and semen was found at the Birchwood Drive apartment, as well as on swabs taken from Holly, and that blood on Reginald's clothing had come from Heather. Though Reginald's lawyers tried to argue this blood could have gotten on him after coming into contact with his brother, and didn't mean he was actually at the crime scenes. Tronda Adams, Jonathan's girlfriend, also took the stand, claiming she had met up with both brothers on the night that Andrew was kidnapped, as well as on the night Anne was shot. On that night, Jonathan gave her a black handgun matching the one that was found and asked her to clean it and look after it for him. She even claimed that the brothers had both visited her on the day of the massacre, leaving around 9 p.m., with Jonathan calling her at around 3 in the morning that night. This sequence of events perfectly matched the timings of the Wichita massacre. Reginald's girlfriend, Stephanie Donnelly, also testified, claiming she was unaware of either brother having a job, yet saw them carrying large sums of money throughout December. She also testified that Reginald brought several stolen items into her home, which were found to belong to the victims. Having presented nearly 1,000 pieces of evidence against the brothers, the prosecution rested its case against them, leaving the two teams of defense attorneys with an impossible mountain to climb if they were going to somehow win their cases. Jonathan's lawyer's only real evidence was an Amtrak ticket dated to the day of the murders, claiming Jonathan had planned to use it, but had gotten lost leaving Wichita that night. Reginald's team wanted to testify that his brother had apparently told him he'd been with a man who was tripping and shooting people, and that he'd moved stolen goods to Stephanie's apartment to help his brother. But this supposed evidence was ruled as inadmissible hearsay and dismissed. Bizarrely, they even replayed Holly's police interview for the jury, which only cemented the brutality of what she'd been through, with some jurors as well as Holly having to leave the courtroom because they found it too distressing to watch. Seemingly, they had hoped that Holly's vagueness in identifying Reginald in the footage would help their case. During their closing statements, both defense teams shifted blame onto the other brother, claiming their client had nothing to do with it, with Jonathan's team focusing on the various identifications of Reginald, and Reginald's team focusing on Jonathan's DNA being linked so solidly to the crimes. Ultimately, on November 4, 2002, the jury reached its verdict and found both Reginald and Jonathan guilty on nearly all counts, including the capital murder charges. The only charges that didn't stick were in regards to the kidnapping and robbery of Andrew, which Jonathan was acquitted for due to lack of evidence linking him to the case. Neither brother showed any emotion as they heard their verdicts read aloud, with Reginald shackled due to threats he'd made to deputies during the trial. As they were escorted from the courtroom, Reginald stared at the victims' families while Jonathan avoided eye contact. The following morning, the jury was tasked with working out the sentence the two brothers deserved: life in prison or death by execution. As the jury deliberated the fate of Reginald and Jonathan, outrage over their crimes reached an all-time high in Wichita. In one incident, a resident displayed effigies of the two brothers hanging from trees in his front yard. With the image recalling the lynching of black men in America's recent past, it led to widespread condemnation, and the resident eventually took them down, claiming it wasn't meant to have racial implications, but to show his anger at the brothers specifically. A number of witnesses and experts presented statements during the sentencing hearing to help determine the fate of the Carr brothers, with various psychologists testifying about the damage their childhood filled with violence and abuse had done to them. Forensic psychologist Mark Cunningham, for example, claimed their childhood left both Jonathan and Reginald emotionally detached and lacking empathy, consequently making them capable of committing brutal acts. Despite this, Cunningham told the prosecution under cross-examination that the brothers unquestionably understood the difference between right and wrong, but that they just didn't care. While the two defense teams pleaded for the jury to give their clients life sentences, Prosecutor Falston instead asked them to not show the brothers mercy, just because they had a troubled upbringing, stating that there was no excuse for what they had done, and that they deserved to receive the death sentence. Interestingly, another expert presented evidence that both brothers had sustained brain damage in their temporal lobes. We've seen this come up in a number of cases before, most recently that of the chessboard killer, where damage to the temporal lobe was cited as a possible explanation for his lack of impulse control and morality. Whether brain damage played a role in this case, however, is unclear. Reginald's ex-wives, who he had children with, also spoke at the hearing, with one of them reading a letter from his 7-year-old son saying he loved him and begging for him to come back. An ex-co-worker of Jonathan even told the court how he had always been kind, polite, and generous when she had worked with him. Both Andrew and Holly gave survivors' statements to the jury, with Holly telling them, "Every day there is a memory or a scar that reminds me of that night. I wake up in sweats from my nightmares. I pace at night because of noises that I think are somebody breaking into my house. And every morning I carefully blow dry my hair to cover up the spot that can no longer grow hair," before going on to describe how every day she fears she is going to be assaulted again, adding, "The sentence imposed on them will be a much kinder sentence than they imposed on me, my friends, and family." After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with their recommendation for Reginald and Jonathan's sentences. They should both receive the death sentence for their crimes. Before he formally sentenced them, Judge Clark told the defendants of their right to make a statement, but they both declined. So Judge Clark officially sentenced them both to death. Once again, neither brother showed any reaction or emotion to the judge's words. In addition to the death penalty, the brothers received life sentences for the murder of Anne with no possibility of parole, as well as around 40 additional years each for the other charges against them. As the brothers were led away from the courtroom, Jason's brother Mark sarcastically wished Reginald a happy birthday before swearing at him, causing Reginald to snap back and be pulled away. Outside the courtroom, family members of the victims embraced each other, as well as the prosecutors and the crime scene investigators. While the family members chose not to comment publicly, Prosecutor Kim Parker, visibly emotional as she hugged Holly, remarked, "Justice has been served, and it is long awaited." The families of the victims later filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state, citing negligence stemming from the paperwork mistake that meant Reginald was released from prison days before the massacre when he should have remained incarcerated. Hearing the case in 2004, the judge agreed that the state's actions had failed the victims, with the jury awarding the families around $500,000 each. However, the ordeal of the victims' families and the two survivors was far from over. In Kansas, death sentences automatically trigger appeals which can take several years to resolve. Since the state reinstated the death penalty in 1994, every death sentence had been overturned by Kansas's highest court, with no execution having been carried out since 1965. To make matters more confusing, in December 2004, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled to overturn the state's death penalty law. However, the Kansas Attorney General then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which upheld the constitutionality of the death penalty in the state. Then in 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned Reginald and Jonathan's death sentences, ruling that their Eighth Amendment rights had been violated when the trial judge refused to give them separate sentence hearings. They ruled that each brother deserved separate sentencing hearings due to the possibility that one could receive more leniency than the other, based on differences in the evidence against them and in their level of culpability. But then once again, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and reversed that decision in 2016, claiming it did not violate the brothers' rights and reinstating their death sentences. Discussing the situation, Prosecutor Folston stated, "No one is entitled to a perfect trial, only a fair one. But this came close to being a perfect trial, in terms of legal issues and being resolved and how we went about trying the case." On death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, both brothers hired new legal teams and attempted to use all of this chaos to be granted resentencing hearings. Both of their new teams criticized their trial lawyers, calling them inadequate, and tried to claim that the jury, which was predominantly white, had been racially biased against them. Their legal representatives even brought attention to an investigation into various police officers at the Wichita Police Department, in which several officers, including one who had worked their case, had been disciplined for exchanging racist, sexist, and homophobic texts and images, presumably trying to imply that the police had racially targeted the two brothers as well. Despite all of this, both brothers continued trying to shift the blame onto each other. Jonathan's team tried to claim that Reginald sexually abused him and held significant power over him, forcing him to obey his commands. While Reginald's team once again tried to claim that almost all of the forensic evidence implicated Jonathan, and not him. In the end, their request for resentencing was denied, and with their death sentences being deemed constitutional by the Kansas Supreme Court, they remain on death row awaiting execution to this day. Detective Rick Craig, who was one of the first to arrive at the field where the four friends were murdered, later told a reporter that he had remained close friends with Holly ever since. Holly herself actually ended up dating and marrying the only other survivor of the Carr brothers' crime spree, Andrew Schreiber, before moving out of Wichita with him. According to Detective Craig, he occasionally visits them with his family, though none of them ever discuss the events of the Wichita Horror together, with him saying of Holly, "I am amazed by her strength. She is so strong. I think she's great. She's an angel." Several scholarships were established to honor the other victims, including one at St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic School where Heather was a teacher, and another at Wichita State University where Anne worked as a librarian. And with that, our deep dive into this very dark and disturbing case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts about it. This case was actually suggested to me in the comments, so if you have any ideas for other cases to cover, please feel free to let me know. If you want to support my channel further, consider joining as a member or signing up over on my newly set up Patreon. I currently can't offer a lot in the way of incentives, but I try to get my new videos up early on Patreon when possible. Speaking of which, I want to give a massive shout out to Willow Hoffman in particular for her support. You have no idea how much it means to me. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.